And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Taking a look at the aviation forecast, starting with flying weather on Tuesday morning, we'll be looking at some marginal conditions throughout much of the west coast and into the south central area, with the trough moving through the state. Otherwise, some marginal conditions down there in the Panhandle with IFR conditions along some of the coastal mountains in that area of the state, but otherwise IFR conditions in the Gulf of Alaska, through the western coastal areas and along the Arctic coast as well, with some fog in those locations. Otherwise, some IFR conditions in the western Brooks Range. And you see that little bit of clearing out there in the Bering Sea, and that's associated with a ridge of high pressure developing that part of the state. And then for Tuesday afternoon, clearing conditions over the Panhandle, lingering IFR conditions in the Gulf of Alaska, lingering marginal conditions through the southern mainland, some clearing conditions along the west coast, and lingering IFR conditions along the Arctic coast, but otherwise IFR conditions under that ridge of high pressure, creating some marine stratus in that area of the state, but otherwise some pretty good flying conditions through much of the mainland. And then for Wednesday morning, some lingering marginal conditions along the Alaska Range and into the northern Gulf Coast, and some marginal conditions in the Gulf of Alaska and Panhandle, but otherwise IFR conditions in much of the Northeast Pacific and out there in the Bering Sea and along the Arctic coast. And then for Wednesday afternoon, pretty good flying conditions through much of the state, with a ridge of high pressure making its way into the mainland by this time. And some continuing pretty good flying weather across the Panhandle. You can see some pretty good VFR conditions there. Otherwise, some lingering marginal conditions just off the coast of the Panhandle, and IFR conditions in the Gulf of Alaska and out there in the Bering Sea and along the Arctic coast. For past conditions on Tuesday, Anaktuvik, marginal decrease into VFR conditions, same for Adigan. And then for the southern Alaska Range, Lake Clark and Merrill went for IFR conditions early, then decreasing to marginal conditions during the day on Tuesday. For rainy, marginal conditions there all day long. And then for windy, marginal improving to VFR conditions. VFR conditions out there in Isabel Pass, and Mentasta VFR there as well. And then Tanita, marginal conditions expected there. Portage, marginal, but you will see some IFR conditions over the eastern entrance. And down there in the Panhandle, with that weak trough that moves into the Gulf of Alaska, some IFR conditions expected there early, and then improving to marginal conditions during the day. For the freezing level, surface freezing level up there in extreme eastern Russia, otherwise 6,000 foot freezing level, dipping into the northern Bering and over into the northwestern part of the state. Otherwise elevated freezing levels down through the Bering and into the central Aleutians and over there in British Columbia. For ice conditions on Tuesday, above 10,000 feet expected, with the areas of isolated moderate over most of the central mainland and into the northern Gulf. Otherwise, some considerable moderate conditions expected over south central and into the northeast Gulf Coast there, or northwest Gulf Coast, I'm sorry. And then for the jet stream, you can see that ridge of high pressure driving clockwise flow, and winds from a northerly direction along the west coast, anywhere between 75 knots and up to 90 knots there as you get into the Alaska Range, Alaska Peninsula, and then southerly winds as you get into the central mainland, with anywhere between 35 and 75 knots there. Otherwise, pretty much light and variable across the Panhandle into the Gulf region. For 9,000 foot winds on Tuesday, you can see that ridge still protected there in the Bering Sea. Otherwise, northerly flow down along the west coast, anywhere between 25 and 45 knots there down through the southwest and Bristol Bay region. And then we get southerly flow coming up through the Gulf of Alaska and into the eastern mainland, and generally light and variable across the Panhandle. For 3,000 foot winds on Tuesday, you can see that low there at the surface, generating counterclockwise flow, 35 knots into the Gulf and into the Kenai Peninsula, And then on the backside of that low, you get northerly winds down through the southwest and Bristol Bay region with 35 knots there as well. And you can see weekly northerly flow coming into the central Aleutians up to 60 knots there in some of those areas. For turbulence on Tuesday, surface of 3,000 feet out there in the central Aleutians, surface to 4,000 feet in portions of the Alaska Peninsula, but otherwise generally pretty good flying conditions across much of the state.